Thank you, everybody, for joining the National Power BI User Group, our July 2025 meetup. We've got a ton of great stuff. We had a wonderful social function for our last meetup in June. That was a huge success. We had maybe a couple hundred people there. It was a really big turnout, great success. I think we're going to keep doing that. We had one in December and then one this past June. I think we're going to sort of maybe do that kind of semi-annual cadence. That seems to be a real big success. But so because of that, we didn't cover anything in from the June release. So we got the June release. We actually just had the July release yesterday or maybe the day before. And we got a bunch of great stuff to cover. So we're going to go over all of that. And then we have from Chris Hyde, he's going to tell us all about tips and tricks for creating a data warehouse in Microsoft Fabric. So that's going to be a great presentation from one of the experts on that topic. So we're really thrilled to have Chris Hyde joining us all the way from Frisco, Texas today. We are going to go over some upcoming events and a bit of what's new in the space. But just a quick reminder that this hasn't been published yet, but we will be publishing this meetup soon. But Thursday, you can go ahead and put it in the calendar, Thursday, August 21st, the Power BI Glow Up Watch a Report Transformation Live by Lakshmi. And so you guys maybe have seen her around. She's got some great talks that she's been doing. And I'm great on the technical side, not as good on the making it look good side. So I'm always excited for an opportunity to learn how to make my Power BI reports look better. So excited to hear from Lakshmi on that. That's next month, August 21st, 11:30 to 1 o'clock. And you can get that Zoom link through the Meetup page. And we are always looking for new speakers. So you can find us on Sessionize. That QR code will take you to our Sessionize page. You can also just go to Sessionize and search for us. I think there should also be a link on our Meetup page to Sessionize. You can also just email me, email Michael Hewitt, email Sekou Tyler, and we'd love to get in touch with you around topics that you'd be passionate in sharing. It doesn't necessarily have to be Power BI. In fact, today we're actually talking about data warehousing in Fabric, which is technically outside of Power BI, but anything that is Power BI or Fabric related, or even doing cool stuff in Excel. So we still have that as part of our legacy. Anything that you want to talk about that you're really passionate about, just give us a shout and we'd love to get you scheduled. All right. So some meetups and some things that are going on both in and around Nashville, and we've got a few more things a bit further afield coming up later. So next week is actually jam-packed full of presentations on Monday, July 21st, Tech Hill Commons in the evening, the data science Nashville meetup. This is Charlotte Ian's group, and so they're doing a student capstone presentation. So those students are always doing some really neat stuff. They're going to talk about those projects that they've been working on in the recent past. Then the next day, also in the evening, the National Data Nerds has a Brilliant Women in Data virtual meetup that you can sign up for. I haven't been to this myself, but I have heard that these are really exceptional meetups. Then the next day, the National Data Engineering Group had a meetup also at Tech Hill Commons in the evening. And Kevin Postlethwaite is going to be describing BI data engineering for the enterprise. He's a director of data engineering at PepsiCo and brings a lot of experience on this subject. So this is, a lot of what we do, but then just sort of plussing that up to another level. This would definitely be the stuff that Chris is going to talk about today with the data warehousing, but it also is probably going to cover some things like ETL, pipelines, and so forth. Then the next day, so this is Thursday evening at Operations Stand Down. So this is actually on 12th Avenue. They're doing a collab with Little Table Nashville. And if you're interested in the product space and not just how to build, but what to build and why, so the National Product Meetup is a great user group for that. We do have several SQL Saturdays coming up, and there's a few of these are a bit further away, but I just wanted to bring these up. So South Florida is actually this weekend. I'm actually speaking at it, so kind of was a little late to plan trips to Miami, but hey, Miami's not a bad place to spend the weekend, right? I'll be there giving 2 talks at South Florida. Baton Rouge is coming up the next weekend, and our very own Jason Romans will be doing, I think, a couple talks in Baton Rouge. Saturday Columbus is coming up 16th of August. That's definitely drivable. Boston and Minnesota are coming up at the end of September. Orlando the weekend after that on the 4th of October. I went to that one 2 or 3 years ago, I think. St. Louis is coming up also drivable-ish, later in the year, and then Houston And then Oregon and Southwestern Washington are planning their meetup, their SQL Saturday, to coincide with PASS Summit that will be occurring just after that. Close to home here in Nashville, we have the 2025 National Innovation Summit on August 14th and 15th. That will be at the Music City Center. This is one of the bigger data analytics, IT focused conferences here in Nashville and Middle Tennessee all year long. So this is definitely one to check out if you're interested in these sorts of things. It is a lot more broad ranging than Power BI or even just Microsoft Analytics. We'll definitely cover a lot of that. We'll cover a lot of things in general, and definitely, I'm sure they're going to have a ton of stuff on AI there as well. At roughly the same time, there's also TechCon 365 Atlanta. This is going to be more Power BI, Fabric, and specifically Dynamics. So it's going to be a lot of dynamic stuff as well at this conference. So this is in Atlanta, the 11th to 15th of August at the Georgia World Congress Center. And then speaking of Dynamics, the Community Summit is going to be in Orlando later on this year, but they're doing a roadshow. And so that will be here in Nashville. That's August 14th. And so that will be at the downtown Hilton. I actually went to speak not at one of the roadshows, but the main conference in San Antonio last year. So that's the one that will be in Orlando later on this year. And so I didn't realize that they were going to be doing a roadshow here in Nashville. It could be a great conference to attend, particularly if you're interested in anything that's Dynamics focused. This is one of the great conferences to hear more about that. Also, in the realm of community days, if you guys were able to attend the Nashville Community Day we had back in April, Daniel Glenn put that on. He also puts one on in Memphis and one in Knoxville. So the one in Memphis is coming up October 2nd through the 3rd. And so that will be in the Microsoft office in Memphis. I was there last year as well and had a great day. I can't remember if it's free or it's, I think, either free or really cheap. It's a great opportunity there as well. If you like that 15-minute thing that Daniel and company did in Nashville this year, I think you're going to do a more traditional setup in Memphis this year as they did in Memphis last year. We might do the 15-minute one again in Nashville next year. We'll see, but I think this one's going to be a little bit more traditional. And then that community summit, as I was talking about, so that the larger North American conference will be in Orlando the 19th to the 23rd. So that's the one that I attended in San Antonio last year. So that's a really fun conference as well. And then one of the big conferences all year long, Path Data Community Summit 2025. So that will be in Seattle at the Seattle Convention Center on November 17th through the 21st. So you can hit up that SQL Saturday a few days before, and then you can come to the PASS Summit, and then you basically head on for Thanksgiving. The biggest Fabric Power BI conference all year long, even bigger than PASS now, is the Microsoft Fabric Community Conference, or FabCon as it's called, March 16th to the 20th, 2026. It was in Las Vegas this past year, and next year it will be at the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta, Georgia. If there's one conference that you can attend, one of the really big major conference with thousands of attendees, I think this would probably be the one. So definitely keep this on your radar. And I know that they have, if you go to this conference, and once we do this, there's a sort of convince your boss button page that you can go to, and it'll help you do that. And obviously ask ChatGPT or any of the LLMs to do that as well. Okay. So I just want to talk about what is new in Power BI. So this is going to cover both the June and July 2025 updates, since we haven't covered the June 2025 update. We haven't had a session since then. And so I just wanted to point out, for anyone who has been around since day one, Power BI, it turns 10 years old this month. Can't believe it's been a long journey. I've been working with Power BI almost that entire time. They came to the party maybe about a year or so late, but been around for most of that journey. There's a lot of things that are going on in conjunction with that. There's a data visualization contest that you can take part in. There's going to be a live stream on July 24th with Guy and a Q. To find the link for that, you can go to blog.powerbi.com, and it will have the June and July meetups, and both of those have links to this July 24th meetup with Guy and Q. And they're also giving expert-led sessions to prep for the PL 300 exam, and they are also offering discount vouchers for that PL 300 exam. So definitely be sure to pick one of those. I wanted to mention the secure collaboration on sensitive data in Power BI desktop. So I believe this came out in June, if I remember correctly. And so this allows for sensitivity labels in your Power BI files, and you can list things as being confidential or for internal use only. And what this will do is it will block data from being able to be exported. You can only publish files back to the original workspace that they came from, and you cannot change or remove the sensitivity label in Power BI desktop. So these are some of the ways that you can allow people to encrypt and securely share data in PBX files in Power BI desktop, but without losing that sensitivity, and it'll help it sort of connect in to Microsoft Preview a lot better. And so if you are reporting on very sensitive data, this is a great way to make sure that data is kept securely. Wanted to mention visual calculations. So they have added parameter pickers. And so that would be these bits here, so the field and column and search value. And so not only does it make it a lot easier to fill out your visual calculations, but it also just adds a bit of resilience as the visual is changed. For example, if you pick something in the columns and then you change the configuration of your matrix, your visual, and column is no longer relevant, it will just simply remove that component. It's not hard to put it in. And essentially it will, so if you have, a field and you're specifying it, by column, and you take that out, you take the columns out of the visual, then it'll just go back to summing it up in its entirety. It may or may not be exactly what you're looking for. It may or may not be exactly the functionality you're looking for, but it will retain some resiliency and not make the visual quite as brittle as it might have been in the past. This is a bit more of that resiliency. So you can also refer to other fields, other measures that are in here, that are in your visual calcs. And one of the other things that I really enjoyed was adding of order by as a parameter in most of the visual calculations. So the example that they gave in the release was doing a Pareto or a percent of grand total. And while that would seem to be a very obvious thing, turns out that in the past, without the order by, you had to use windowing functions and then an order by within the windowing function, and it just kind of became this convoluted process. So this code what you see here in the top right is how you would have done correctly a Pareto function using visual calcs in the past. And now you can just use this running sum function, and you can put an order by in the second function and the second parameter to your running sum, and it will allow the Pareto to work correctly. So just simplifies how you get to the finish line. All right. The other thing is fill parameters. Fill parameters actually been around for a little while. They were first released in preview in 2022, and they are finally at long last going into general availability. And this allows you to select different fields to add to your visual, or different measures that you can add to your visual as well. So it allows you to use a slicer to add or remove different fields and different visuals to add or remove different fields and different measures to your visual in a very, very easy way. So you see here in the bottom left that currently under product category, they have product class as the next level in that hierarchy. And you can just click on color, and rather than product class, it would show product category and then product color if you were to select that one. The other thing that they did was they are having the matrices to now retain their expanded or collapsed state. So before, as you would switch these in and out, the matrices would sort of collapse and they wouldn't remember that state. And so here you can see that as you have accessories expanded on the left, when you have class, if you swap out the class for color, the accessories stay expanded, and it's just a little bit better functionality, better usability. So I think that's the sort of thing that my clients were definitely asking for, and I couldn't come with too much until now. So that's just a nice quality improvement. This is a really nice one, organizational themes. So if you guys are tenant admins, or if you work with the marketing team for your company, this is going to be something that they will be really excited about. If you've got a bunch of reports and they all use inconsistent theming, or maybe no theming at all, well, now you can your Power BI tenant admins can create and implement an organizational theme. Now, it doesn't forcibly apply that theme in any of the reporting, but what it will do is it can present itself. The theme can be made available in the themes gallery within Power BI Desktop and in edit mode in the service. And another thing that you can also do is that you can use these for Copilot generated reporting. And so I was talking with someone just a few months ago, and I was taking, the Power BI, the Copilot generated reports. They're nice, a bit simplistic, but they don't use your company's theme. Well, now they do. So that's going to be a great usability improvement because you can create these really well polished, centralized models and then open them up to folks and then allow them to use Copilot to build whatever reporting that is important to them. And with these themes, you can now guarantee that they use your company's colors and fonts and theme presets. You can now use Power Query editing in the web for import mode. So this is just a screenshot of that. So this is a really nice thing. I'm having against Power BI Desktop, but for some reason, I just have this vision of being able to do everything in the Power BI service and never having to go into Power BI Desktop. I mean, I don't mind Power BI Desktop; it's a fine tool. It's certainly improved a lot over the years. But it's really nice to know that we have better and better functionality in both places, so we can do more and more in the service that we used to only be able to do in Power BI Desktop. For connectivity, this may impress nobody but me. I might be the only person who cares about this, but you can now connect to a Postgres database without having to manually install drivers. I had a client a while back that used Postgres. It was actually my first time using Postgres, and I thought that an open source database was going to be pretty underwhelming, but I actually really enjoyed working with Postgres. I'm actually working with a specific flavor of Postgres right now on another project. And it's a lot of fun to work with Postgres. If you guys have never had the chance to use it, give it a try. It's pretty cool. It does use anti-SQL, but I think it uses a specific flavor called PL SQL. So most of what you know, if you're familiar at all with T-SQL, will translate, but there might be just a few differences. But in the past, you had to go to your gateway and install drivers, and now you don't have to do that. So that is really handy and just lowers that bar to connecting Power BI to Postgres. And they've also got a new Snowflake connector as well. So if you guys are using Snowflake in your enterprise, this should definitely speed up your workflow probably, but also the connectivity that you're making. Yeah. And so those are all of the updates that I have for June and July in Power BI. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Hyde. He's going to tell us all about building a data warehouse in Fabric.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Let me get shared over here. All right. Y'all can see my slide deck okay?
I sure can.
Perfect. All right. So this is me. I'm Chris Hyde. My pronouns are he, him. As Michael said, I'm in Frisco, Texas at the moment, but I actually live in Albuquerque. I run the user group out there. A couple years ago, I had Sekou speak for my group on the promise that I'd speak for you all. And finally, like 2 years later, I'm living up to the promise. So I know he's not on the call today, but yeah, next time y'all talk to him, just let him know that I lived up to my end of the bargain. All right. If you like this presentation, the important stuff is in the bottom right here. Get on Blue Sky, get on LinkedIn, tell everyone you know how good the presentation was. Now, if you don't like it, well, that's what the email's for. Just drop me a line. Let me know what I could do better next time or what you wanted me to talk about that I didn't, because this is sort of designed to be a sort of a presentation that will live a long time. As things get widely known, I can drop out a couple of tips and tricks and then add in some new ones. So I'm always interested to know kind of like what you all are going to be interested in. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I know this is a Power BI group, so I expect most of you have some familiarity with Fabric and with Fabric Data Warehouse, but I'm not going to assume anything. So I've just got a couple slides to anyone that hasn't worked with or watched Fabric videos yet. I'll get you all up to speed. Then I'm going to talk about some tips for designing for performance in your data warehouse. Because it's a Power BI group, I definitely want to talk about the new direct lake mode. So this is something that's an alternative to import mode or direct query. And that's going to have some design implications. So let's talk about that. We've got some workarounds here for some T-SQL limitations. This is one of the big parts of the presentation because when I started putting this together, I'm like, okay, I'm going to take some code from one of my clients and just one of their simple dimensions, and let's just build this in Fabric. And immediately I ran into a bunch of T-SQL limitations. So I want to pass those along. Now, thankfully, a couple of those have been addressed within the last 2 months. So we'll talk about what they were, and hopefully that won't impact any of you, but there definitely are some. If you're hoping to lift and shift, you're going to have a couple of issues there. I will cover some of my ELT patterns that'll help us understand, my code when we look at the T-SQL limitations. But also for those of you who are not as familiar with data warehousing, or maybe we used to have the concept of the accidental DBA, maybe you're an accidental data warehouse builder. That'll, just some more kind of in the vein of tips and tricks to get you all up to speed. Now, one thing you may notice is not on the agenda is Copilot. Just want to call that out because it seems that you can't do a presentation these days without mentioning it. So I'll mention it just to say that I won't be mentioning it again. So, what is Fabric? It's Microsoft's next generation. It's the all-in-one data analytics product. So it's not just the data warehousing, but the data engineering, data science tools, and because Power BI has such a big user base, we're going to put it into the same portal as Power BI and use all the same kind of GUI pieces and put it all together in one package. And they're going to I'm sorry, I'm just getting over a cold here. They're going to deliver this as software as a service rather than platform as a service. So if you try to do what you can do in Fabric and let's say the AWS cloud, you might be using Airflow to move your data around. You might be using Databricks to transform it. And you might be putting it in Snowflake. You might be using Tableau as the visualization engine on top of that. And that's a lot of different bits and pieces to bolt together, make sure the security works, and just a lot of different tools that you need to be able to have those skills in. The idea here is let's put it all into one place. Let's make all those connections seamless, and yeah, hopefully not as much need to expose all the knobs and buttons. Right. Hopefully it should be just a situation where you plug it in and it works like any other piece of software. One of the keys here, we've got our integrated data lake, which is called One Lake, but we're hopefully just having one copy of our data there. Right. I know there's a lot of BI folks on the call. So how much of your day is spent just moving data from one place to another? Like the big standard is maybe 80% of your day is ETL or ELT. So what we want to do here, is get one copy. Let's not be moving everything around. If it's in our data lake, Power BI can read it straight from the data lake. We don't have to necessarily do an import and copy the data and divert it back. We still have that option, but it's not something that we need to do. Sorry, my little feline coworker is here taking up all the mouse moving space. All right, so here's architecturally what Fabric looks like. You can see, not sure if you can see my mouse that well. Let's see this one lake here. Everything is stored in one lake and all the compute is separated. So the compute doesn't exist, until you actually need to run something, and it's separated. So you think of SQL Server, you've got your MDF file, you've got your database engine. You can't have one without the other in SQL Server. Yeah, they're not useful at all. But here the idea is we're storing our data in this open source Delta Parquet format. And then any of our different compute engines, whether we're using T-SQL for data warehousing or PySpark for data engineering, KQL for real-time analytics, or the Vertipack engine for Power BI, that all read data just when you need them to, at one time straight from this one lake. So then what is Fabric DW? So the idea of Fabric DW is it's our T-SQL-based data warehousing experience. You could do data warehousing in what they call a lakehouse using PySpark, which is usually Python-based, could be Scala. But that's mainly for, the people that are dedicated data engineers. For a lot of us, we've come from the SQL data warehouse world. Everything we do is in T-SQL, all our transformations, all our querying, and especially like our data analysts. They know how to query using T-SQL, querying using Python and Pandas and NumPy, maybe not so much. So let's have an experience, even though it's in this new Fabric product, that still feels, home enough for everyone. So we're going to have denormalized tables. And they'll be optimized for reporting. So those of you who've had to query data against your business systems, you know that sometimes you've got to join 10, 15 tables together to get the data you need. Yeah, you've got to join, the person to the address and the address to the state and maybe the state to the country. In a data warehouse, not specifically a Fabric data warehouse, but almost any data warehouse, you're going to do all those joins and move them into one customer table, for example. Yes, you're repeating data, but the data integrity is taken care of by the business system under the cover. You're essentially creating a copy of that in a slightly different shape to make it really easy for people to write queries against it and for Power BI to just point at it and work. So we've got stored procedures, same as we do in the on-premises product. So that allows us to, write code to do our transformations, then save that code up into the, it's going to say up into the database. It's not 100% a database, into the database-like object, but still everything's stored as Parquet files. And as we showed on the architectural diagram, everything's queryable through all our queryable tools, especially, Power BI. Though it's Parquet, it's open source, and it's a Parquet is like a columnar equivalent of CSV. Do you think that Vertipack stores everything in columnar storage, like column store indexes, where a repeated value in a column is stored once, and then what else is stored as pointers to it? And that allows for a really good amount of data compression, right? Same thing here with our Parquet files work exactly the same. All right, so into our tips and tricks. And some of these should be fairly simple to you, and some of them may be like light bulbs going off, like, oh my goodness, why didn't I think of that? This is one of those for me, because a lot of my customers are still in on-premises situations. They don't have to worry about latency with them because their business system and their reporting system are probably one on top of the other in the same rack in their data center. But here we might have a situation where, our business system is in one region, the majority of our users are in another region. Where do we want to locate Fabric environment? Obviously, we want to co-locate the resources where possible. We want to think about that network latency between our end client, and the compute engine. So if I'm sitting connected to it with Management Studio, yeah, and I'm in central US, but my fabric is in East US too, there's going to be a certain amount of network latency between those regions that I just can't deal with. So maybe if all my end users are going to be in central, that's where I want to put my fabric, right? Same thing if we've got shortcuts to maybe S3 buckets or the Google Cloud equivalent, yeah, wherever those end destinations are located. Yeah, let's minimize latency by thinking about, is it appropriate to put our fabric instance nearer there. Large result sets are going to have a lot of latency. Again, something we might not have to worry about, especially in the Fabric GUI itself, is not as efficient as connecting to Management Studio or even Azure Data Studio. I feel like I should pour out a little bit of my drink for Azure Data Studio as that's going away. But any result set more than 10,000 rows, yeah, you can't use the Fabric GUI to bring that back. And yeah, it's going to be a little more efficient due to the TLS and encoding to bring to Management Studio or Azure Data Studio, as I've said. So just think about that. If something seems very slow to query, the Fabric GUI is not really the place for it. And we've got a little link here to go back to some of Microsoft's official guidelines on these things. All right, our table design. We're going to set our warehouse tables into something called a star schema. If you've been doing data warehouses for a long time, this is nothing new. So this part of Fabric, it's exactly the same. I talked about what denormalized data meant. We're going to be dividing our tables up into two types. So fact tables, those are countable things, and dimension tables that are slice and dicing by. And there'll also be some integration tables. So that's a little abstract. Let's look at the famous New York taxi cab data set, just a subset of that. And before anybody complains, yes, all the relationships on here are back to front. That was my bad making the diagram for the GUI. So just, don't look at the one-to-many relationships. So in the center here, the center of our star, here's our fact table. These are the things that can be counted. How many trips were taken? This is the things that if you're writing a SQL query, you'd be aggregating. So you'd be putting a sum or an average, a min or a max on the metrics in the fact table. Then the ways that you're going to slice and dice are the dimensions orbiting, the fact table. And they're the things that in a query you'd be putting in your group by. So I can group by city. So I'm counting all the taxi cabs for, by city. Well, it's sum of probably one for the trip, grouped by city. Yeah, our taxi cab license, our taxi medallion, the dates, geography here is both, where from and where to. Again, nothing new from a warehousing standpoint, but if you're that accidental warehouse person, you may have heard the term star schema and not really know what it means. Yeah, what it means is one fact table and then one layer of dimension tables. It's not like in the business system where you have customer joined to address, joined to state, or joined to city, joined to state, and so on. So just one level there. I should really say kind of why we do this. So two main things. One, it's a lot easier to query. That way, here at most, if we needed something from everything, we've got 4 joins. The other thing is the engine has to make those joins too. The engine can be much more efficient the fewer joins that it has to make. So easier for us to query, easier for the engine to return the data as well. All right. We've got to think about table design as well. And some of these tips, these are not necessarily new, and a lot of them also apply to, business systems, to OLTP systems as well as OLAP systems. But we should think about using the smallest data type possible. So use a small int instead of an int for a year, for example. Now, these things don't individually, they don't have a huge performance hit. But if you think about, every column in a database, I've got a small warehouse for one of my customers in Fabric, and I'm doing some documentation for them. And it's got 360 dimensional attributes and what we'd consider to be a fairly small, warehouse implementation. You think about using the wrong data types on all those, it does start to add up. One thing that is a little unusual here, because everything is Parquet kind of behind the scenes, you need to make sure that you use data types supported by Parquet. If you're feeling masochistic, pull up the Parquet like data spec, the full spec sometime. You might be surprised to find that Parquet only natively supports like 7 different data types. So you have to have things that are compatible with that. So you'll find there are some things. Date time is a frequent problem for people. There's no set time data type, for example. We might have a situation where in our business system we're using the time data type because in that case we don't care about the date. Well, you can't store it that way in Parquet. Parquet doesn't have just time. Also, the date time is date time 2 to precision up to 6. So if you have an even more precise, maybe you've got a date time 2 down to 8 scale, that's too precise for Parquet. That's not something that, we should be yelling and blaming Microsoft for. That's because of the official Parquet spec, right? So Microsoft has implemented something open source here so that it's as widely usable by as many tools as possible. But that does mean there's going to be some possible inconsistencies with, say our on-premises or our Azure SQL DB data types. Yep. We're going to want to use not nulls instead of null where possible in our warehouse, especially for primary and foreign key fields. I can't imagine a situation where I'd allow a null in a primary, or obviously not a primary, but even in a foreign key field. Yeah, again, we want to make sure all those joins can be inner joins with no issues. We want to be able to just point our BI tools at our warehouse and have them immediately understand how things go. Now, one thing, let's see if the demo works for this. We're going to have some tools that seem like they're doing everything for us, and then they create a bad table schema. So let's jump over to Fabric. I did not sacrifice to the demo gods today, so let's see how well this performs. Those of you who've been using Fabric for a while know that the performance can vary day to day. I'm just going to create a new pipeline. The fact that I'm waiting that long for it just to get to this point doesn't bode well. But I will just use the copy data assistant here. And let's see. Oh, here it is, the sample data. I'm going to pull in this public holidays database. That's really just one table from a CSV. Right? We can see it's just different countries and all of the holidays in those different countries. So I'm going to put it into my Lakehouse. It's already built. I'm going to load it to a new table. Note that there's nowhere here for me to spell it. Okay, this string is only 100 characters. This string is 50. So if I go through and save this and go ahead and run it, I think I've got like a good cooking show. I've got one of these already done in my lake house.
Chris, quick question for you. So you're talking about how the data type is just string, but not a specific length. But you can also layer a SQL endpoint over top of a lakehouse. I'm guessing
Yeah.
that doesn't then somehow give you the ability to add just to resolve that problem.
Right. Yeah, the way to resolve it, is to design your table beforehand. Make the table, with the correct schema that you want. And I'm not see, I must be in the wrong place. What we were gonna see is when you run the create table script, we see all our strings got created with 8,000 characters. So yeah, Fabric is good that our like maybe business analyst power users can go ahead and import a new table into our ecosystem with just clicks, right? It makes it very easy for them. It's very democratic that way, but it doesn't always mean it's going to be the most efficient. So if they were doing something that we sort of needed to productionalize, yeah, we're going to have to go back, analyze the data, figure out what the correct schema would be. Yeah, otherwise we're going to be stuck with all these strings and Barker 8,000s until the end of time.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, a couple examples like we've talked about year using index. I say in here, you can use a small int for a year. For decimals, don't just say decimal because that'll create it at the default, which is 38 characters long. So actually, use your precision and scale for the actual values. If you have an ID field joining tables together, make it numeric. It's much more efficient to join on a 4-byte integer than a 20-byte varchar. Yeah, we don't have fixed length string data in Parquet, so we're always using varchar, using nut nulls wherever, and yeah, let's not use those varchar 8,000s. I mean, it's varchar, so does it take up any more storage space? No, not really. An extra character to say end of string. Where it does take up space is when the query engine is figuring how much space do I need to save to these results in the query that I'm building. And that's when you see, oh, the 16:1 ratio on that field. All right. So those are some simple design tips. You've probably come across similar ones, but for those of you accidental warehouse folks, I hope that was helpful. Now let's talk about direct lake mode. So I'm going to switch to the architectural slide here. We know that Power BI historically we've had two different modes, right? We've had direct query, which is the top row with the purple warehouse. And that allows us to go back to our source system, which is great. So we have data that's right up to the second. But it can be slow because maybe we're not controlling the indexes or the data structure on that database that we're querying. So a lot of times we'll use import mode, right? Which is great. We pull the data into Vertipack, super fast to report from, but it's only as up to date as the last time we did that refresh. Twice a day, once a day, whatever it is. In the Fabric world, we've got something called direct late, which is, I think the marketing they tried to say it's the best of both worlds. We'll talk about that in a second. But the idea is you notice how it doesn't have a database here. It goes straight from Power BI straight back to those Parquet tables. So it's always up to the second with what you've loaded in Parquet. And we never needed to set up an import mode. The idea is because we're going back to those Delta tables, they're already in Parquet, which is a columnar storage, which gets us great compression. that we should be able to get, performance using Direct Lake nearly as good as import mode over very large sets of data. All right. So that's going to have some design considerations for us if we want to use Direct Lake mode. There are several limitations. We'll talk about them on the next slide. There's a link to go back and see in more detail. Now, I also want to say, if you're thinking about using Direct Lake mode, make sure that you read Marco's article and make sure that your use case is a use case that Direct Lake really performs well at, which is really the very, very large scale. Yeah, very large fact tables. The current client I talked about, the largest fact table is pretty small, only about 13 million rows. And really, we didn't see great performance from Direct Lake. So we built it Direct Lake and then we switched it back over to import mode later. So it's a little bit of a caveat tour. But yeah, if you are using a very, very large, hundreds of gigabytes or larger fact table, yeah, you may want to look at Direct Lake if real-time data is, important to your end users. But there are some things that are not supported here. We can't have tables from more than one warehouse or a warehouse and a lake house, or really any composite model. We can't have calculated columns and tables because you see, we're going straight back to our Delta tables. There's no room for, our Power Query calculated tables or columns here. If we've got any relationships, they can't be based on date time columns. Now, that's probably a bad design anyway. Even if you have a relationship between a fact table and a date table, you're going to want to do that based on an integer. That's going to be much quicker. But just if you're in a situation where your warehouse was built with a relationship based on the date time columns, Direct Lake won't work. And then if your key columns don't coincide, your foreign key is an int, but your primary key is a small int, Direct Lake's gonna fall back. Also, this is a big one for me if the query reads data from a view. We'll talk about a little later on how I like to use views as a semantic layer in my warehouses. That immediately means I can't use direct query. Because again, no SQL endpoint here. The views would live in the SQL endpoint. All right. And there is this little wrinkle with the SSO authentication. Definitely, if you're looking about Direct Lake, go look up the limitations. Sorry, on the Microsoft site. Go read Marco's article on Direct Lake versus import mode. Yeah, so one thing this would do is this would change my schema patterns. So we talked about, I'd be talking about some of my design patterns. So if I'm on premises or, I'm not using Direct Lake, I will use schemas fact for my fact tables, dim for my dimension tables, pretty common. My end users, though, they don't like intuitively rock fact and dimension. What they do intuitively understand is data for the fact tables and lookup for the dimension tables. That is a construct that makes sense to them. So I will usually put views there. Let's get a couple other bonuses. One, anything in my tables that I call plumbing. If I have slowly changing dimensions and I have start and end effective dates, I use hashes for my change detection. Right? My users don't want to see a big binary hash in their data. That doesn't make sense for them. Also, Power BI doesn't really want to store those in Vertipack either. Right? If every hash on every table is unique, you can't compress that using Vertipack. There's no need for that stuff to be in the views. It's in the tables where it needs to be as plumbing, but it is not in the views. So yeah, if I'm using Direct Lake, yeah, I can't have those views. So I'm probably just going to go straight to data and lookup for my tables and keep ETL for my orchestration items. I'll also say that I'm not sure if I mentioned this later on. One thing that views allow me to do is if I have role-playing dimensions, I can create separate views for those. So let's say I have a table of appointments, right? We have a lot of dates there. You have your appointment date. You have your completed date for when it went through. If it needs canceled, you have your canceled date or a rescheduled date. If you all point those back to a date key pointing back to one date table, it's pretty much inevitable that somebody's going to connect to the wrong one at the wrong point and have a report inconsistency. So what I'll do is I'll create views for each one of those. Now the views all go back to the underlying table, the underlying date table, but the fields themselves will be called appointment date instead of just date, canceled date, rescheduled date. So it makes it very difficult for, the end users to get those wrong just by, say, choosing the wrong alias to point to a date. So that's another a reason for using the views there. All right, so let's talk about modeling our dimension tables. So one of the things, again, a lot of you folks, this is old hat, but for those of you who are new or maybe accidental, this term slowly changing dimensions is something that comes up. The idea is that you want to track history over time. Now, in some cases, we've got different types. There are more than just the three types here. These are the three most common. So type 0 is something that will never change. So if I have a date table, I can look up the 17th of July, 2025. It's always going to be a Thursday. It can never not be a Thursday. So that'll never change. That's what we call type 0. A type 1 is an update in place. So where you don't need to maintain the history. For example, a college that I'm working with, we've got a student table, a student dimension table. If I'm in there because I'm taking a class and I decide I want to be known as Christopher instead of Chris, that's fine. We just update it and I'm Christopher going forward, going all the way back. It's not that that's something that, once it changes, it's like it always was. But we might have data versioning. It's important for us to report gender and ethnicity back to the state and federal governments. But those are things that can change in the data. And it could change because a student's identity changes. It could change because they messed up filling in the form from one semester to the other. It could change because we now have different options for ethnicity based on federal guidelines. But we always have to be able to get back to what our reporting was for fall 5 years ago. Who was which gender, which ethnicity in our system then. So what we'll do is we'll have a row for the student. And as long as the row is still active, we'll have an end date field that'll be out to infinity. Or 2099, which is as close to infinity as is going to matter for my career. When that value changes, we end date that record and we add a new row for that student starting today, ending into infinity. Right? So we always have, a fact record will tie to one or the other of them as is appropriate for the time. But that way we get our data versioning. And we can mix these different types. within our same dimension table. Let's see. All right. So these are the metadata fields that I keep in my plumbing, the fields that I probably won't expose in my views because my end users don't care about any of this. We've talked about the start and end effective dates for our slowly changing dimensions. I also like to include an active record flag that's a yes or no so that that's easier for people to query. I have a last updated date time so people know when the data is up to date. I will have a source system name and a source system key so that I can always track back to where that row in the dimension came from. That's also my business key, so I know as I'm comparing records from one day to another, I know that those two things should be the same. Now you may wonder, why do I have source system name? I see quite a lot of time a situation where we've got multiple systems feeding in. We might have an employee table, and we're a big company, and the company's so big that different departments use different HR systems. So they all feed in differently. And the key, business key 1001 and system X, Y, and Z could relate to somebody completely different. So we've got to have that combination of name and key. And then I use these hash values. And I use that to track my change in the slowly changing dimensions. So let's think about if I wanted to, detect a change across my student dimension. Right? My student dimension has all the demographics for each student. There's about 60 different demographic things that we track at my one client. So if I'm detecting changes, I have where field one in my destination and field one in my source are not the same, or field two, or field three. That's a very, very long where clause. That's awful to maintain. What is much easier is to take all those things that are together, take all the data elements that are type one and create a hash out of that. So then I'm just comparing based on my name and key, where is that 64 byte hash value different? So it's a much quicker comparison. Hashing things together is a very simple operation. The comparison is not as simple. So that it speeds things up. I'll have a separate value for my type ones and my type twos. So it's very obvious. Did this change? Did it change because of a type one? Or did it change because of a type two? Or both?
So,
Right.
Chris, so if I understand this correctly, so if you detect that the type one hash values are not lining up, so you would just go and update all of the type one values in the active record or
Exactly.
in the active
But
and the inactive records?
yep. Yep. So let's find, should have a stored procedure example here. If not, I can pull it up in my, so this procedure, this just does the inserts and updates. So it's based on like the final data set being in another table. We'll talk about that in a second when we look at the T-SQL limitations. But so I've got my data set, my end goal data set. I always have these comments to help me. Okay, which data elements are the business keys, which are derived directly from the business keys, so they can't really change because if the key changes, that's a whole new row. Okay, what are for that, term code in this case, which fields are type one changes? And this one actually doesn't have any type two changes. But my procedures will do the same thing. If the record is no longer in the source system, I'll mark it as inactive and I'll end the effective date. And so in this case, it's just where, the record, because I've got a left join, the record doesn't exist anymore. If I was doing this with a field that would have type twos or a table that had type two fields, the same logic happens also when the type 2 value changes. So I come down to my type 1 change. Yeah. Note, even though I've got 20 fields here, my where clause is one field because I'm just comparing the hash value, but I'm updating absolutely everything. And it doesn't matter, like Michael, as you're saying, whether the record is the active record or whether it's a record that was formerly active because it changed because of an SCD2.
So am I
For
right?
the student example, let's say I have 3 different records in the student table because I've changed my ethnicity through either self-identification or changes in the format. So I've got 3 different records. Like for this period, I was this ethnicity or this combination of ethnicity. For this period, I was this ethnicity. Now I'm identifying as this ethnicity. But I changed my name to Christopher. So I should be Christopher in all those different, all that history back to 0.
And then if you had a SED type 2 hash difference, you would update, I guess, type 2. Was just close
So
out
if I
the
have a
active
type
records
2, then I will end date the old record up here,
and then
and
enter the
then
new
I
one.
will add a whole new record
Yeah. Got it.
down here. Yeah, and where this is just looking for brand new records, it would be where brand new record or the type 2 hashes are different.
Got it. Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Right. So the other thing I will have is sentinel values. Now, there's always going to be instances where you point a fact back to a dimension and the dimension record doesn't exist. Sometimes it's bad data. Sometimes it's missing data. Sometimes it's data that isn't there, but you expect it not to be there. Let's look at my appointment example. If I went to my appointment when it was scheduled originally, my cancel date would be null in my business system. So it does joining to my cancel date dimension. How do I do that? Maybe my appointment shows as canceled, but nobody put in the canceled date. That's kind of a different case, right? We expected data to be there, but it's not there. One thing I always do is I put records in my dimension tables to cover those 2 instances. If we just don't know what the data is, I'm going to point back to a record with ID -1 that says, unknown. Right. If I know that if I don't know what the data is, but I don't expect there to be data, my other example here is my grade table for the student for my college, right? We know which students are in which class, but during the active term, they don't have a grade yet. So we still want to point back to the dimension table because we always want to have those keys be not nulls. Because we always want to be sure when we're looking at our fact table, okay, what does that lack of data mean? And we want our BI tools to be able to point at those and not have to figure out, is this an inner join or is this a left join? Worst thing, we don't want people who don't really understand to just do inner joins and not realize that they're dropping things out. Or a BI tool that's always programmed to do inner joins because it sees the same key in 2 different tables. Right? So let's make sure that all inner joins work. Let's take out, and this is all about making things easy to query for our users and our tools. Let's make sure that everything is an inner join all the time between our facts and dimensions. All right. So given that, now we'll start talking about the T-SQL limitations. The bad news is the true lift and shift isn't quite there yet. So if I want to take everything from my on-premises client and just push my database project into the Fabric environment, we're not gonna have a good time. The good news is several of the things I'm going to talk about today are on the product roadmap. The better news is two of the things actually got implemented in May. So yeah, we're already like way better off than we were 2 months ago. I just want to cover them because we know how with Fabric things don't always work the way you want them to right away. Yes, let's just talk about that. Let's talk about a workaround in case you try to use the newly implemented piece and it doesn't work right away. So the first problem, and this is one that has been fixed, but there were no temp tables. So I use temp tables generally for two different ways. One way is to make the complex business logic simpler. As a consultant, when I go into my clients, I'm usually there because they don't have somebody that can write all singing, all dancing T-SQL. So what I don't want to do in the situations where I have really complex transformations is to write something that they can't maintain going forward. Even worse, it could be me that has to maintain it because it breaks and they call me back in a year later and I look at this code that I wrote and can't figure out what the heck I was thinking at that point in time 12 months ago. So I'll use temp tables to separate out the business logic into manageable chunks. Is it important most of the time for things to be tippy top speed? No, that's actually in my world at least, that's less of a consideration than making sure that I'm leaving my customers in a good place going forward. The other thing that does is it helps me separate all that complex business logic from the plumbing. We just looked at plumbing stored procedure, in fact. But if I can take my data set, in that case, we were looking at student terms, and put everything into a temp table the way it should look today, then it's very easy to compare my dimension table to that temp table. That's my new source. Okay, well, that doesn't exist or didn't exist. So the workaround was to create a temp schema and physically materialize a table there to act as a temp table. And problem being is if we had multiple things hitting that temp table at the same time, we could have concurrent updates. It's not a problem with most of my clients because most of the time this is happening, running from one scheduled job and not multiple things hitting the same temp table. But it could be something to consider. Now, thankfully, we do have session scoped temp tables in Fabric as of May. So this shouldn't be a limitation anymore. But if you find there's a problem with the temp tables and you need to go back to physically materializing like a table that acts like a temp table, just watch out for that concurrent updates. Yeah. You could do something fancy by using dynamic SQL and naming the temp table with a GUID at the end to effectively session scope it. I mean, that's what, happens to, temp tables and, your on-prem system. If you've ever looked at, how a temp table is really defined in sysobjects. So you could implement something like that. It's kind of ugly, if you really needed to, handle the concurrency issue. Hopefully most of the time you wouldn't. Oh, yeah, I guess I had a slide for that. Could say that is only session scoped. Globally scoped temp tables are still not available. In the number of times that I've needed a global temp table in my 30-year career, I can count on one hand. So I don't think that's a big issue. But if you did need a globally scoped temp table, you'd have to, consider a physical table workaround. Alright. Yeah. SQL limitation number 2 is there's no insert into the results of a stored procedure execution. Right? When I'm on premises today, how do I populate that temp table that the plumbing does the comparison with? Well, I just call an insert into an exec straight in there. Right? Again, one thing that does, not sure if I really covered it there. I did a little bit, but that transformation logic, I want in a separate stored procedure from my plumbing. Right? I want to be able to run the stored procedure that tells me what something should look like. So if I need to make a change to my business logic, I can just run it and see the output. I don't have to run it, but make sure I've taken out the plumbing bits before I run it. That, yeah, you're always going to mess up, one time doing that. And, you're going to, pump some bad data into your static dimension table and wish for a backup. So that's one reason for separating those two. Again, because we can't do that, I may still be using a physical table for that because there's no insert into exec. Just to keep, my business logic and my plumbing in separate stored procedures. Again, think about concurrent updates. What I really need to do is make sure there's an ideas item logged for this. I don't remember whether there is or not. And then every time I do the session, just tell people, hey, please go vote this up. Because this one isn't even on the roadmap right now. All right, limitation number 3. There's no merge statement. I think this is not really a limitation. I never use a merge statement anyway. In my experience, merge has not always performed well over very large dimensions. My term dimension here that we looked at with maybe 300-400 rows, merge is going to be just fine there. My student dimension with 2 million students, that could be a little iffy. So I always do the separate insert and update statements like we saw in the procedure that we looked at. I don't like, again, for ease of my client's maintenance, I don't like saying, hey, some procedures you can use merge and some you can't on some dimensions. I'd much rather say this is the pattern, for every dimension. So I'll have those separate insert and update statements. If you're going to implement something like that, one thing you want to think about is handling the transactions, if that's important. It may not be important if say the second piece, which was the in-place update, fails. You may be fine having the first piece, which was the rows end dating. You may be fine having had that execute because you're just gonna fix and rerun the second piece. You may have an automated retry built in, and the only reason that it fails is something. I've had situations where network stuff is not 100% reliable, so retries are fine. But you may have situations where, you really want all of those inserts and updates to either succeed or fail together. I just, think about doing that in transactions. One nice thing about Warehouse and Fabric is Warehouse is the only experience that has transactions that can cover multiple tables, right? Or multiple transactions against the same table. We don't have that in Lakehouse. Now, if your existing code heavily relies on merge, don't worry too much. This is scheduled for Q3 this year to be generally available. So it's by the end of September, hopefully. If you're relying on merge and you don't want to have to rewrite a lot of code, maybe you can just wait a couple months and push them. All right, so here's another limitation. There's no identity columns, right? I'm putting new records into my dimension. I need a number that uniquely identifies them. Well, so I'd use an auto incrementing primary key in that dimension, right? We've been doing that for years. So unfortunately, auto increments are not a part of the Parquet spec. So the first go around, Microsoft didn't include those. And then they had a lot of us yelling and yelling, hey, this is actually something pretty important that we need identity columns. So that again is on the roadmap. I think we're looking Q4 this year. So this is something you may need to work around sooner rather than later. So let's jump back to that stored procedure. And this is only going to be for new rows that we're adding in. This for existing rows that we're doing updates on. They won't change. They've already got their auto incremented number. Just going to apply to new rows to the dimension. So I'm declaring a seed at the top of my procedure. And let's go down here to where I'm inserting the new records. And I find what's the biggest primary key. And I put that in my seed before I start doing my inserts. Then once I'm in my inserts, yeah, usually if I'm doing this on-prem, like this term key, this primary key isn't even in my insert statement because the table definition has an identity on it. But now I need to include that in here and I need to populate it with something. So what am I going to populate it with? Well, I'm going to start at that row seed and then use the row number function to get a different number for every row in my insert data set. And in this case, I've got a specific order that I want them to be in. And is that really that important? Not really. This is a personal preference. Note that there's no partition statement because I'm not subdividing that data set by any partitions. I just want the entire set of new rows to be numbered 1 through X. And then their new number will be at row seed plus 1 to at row seed plus X. Fairly simple workaround. It's nice in a pattern for everything. But yeah, just wanted to make sure you all had seen that. Again, you could have a problem with concurrent inserts if you have multiple pieces using the same table, putting data into the same table at the same time. For most of my clients, not an issue. And I said, I think Q4 this year. So yeah, we'll check the roadmap here in a second and take a look. So my last tip is even though we're talking about warehouses, don't be scared to leverage the lakehouse or mix lakehouses and warehouses. So one thing that is pretty common, file storage. We have incoming files that we need to bring in, and we need to store those files. Well, warehouse doesn't have a file storage area, so we're going to need a lakehouse to do that. And many of you may have heard about medallion architecture, which is a way of organizing our data into different layers, bronze, silver, and gold, which is not that different from stage, eprod, and prod. The analytics is just basically coming up with new names for the same concepts every 10 years, right? The idea is that, bronze is our raw data. And silver is sort of our first way to infuse that raw data with value. A simple one may be like our bronze layer is a JSON file, big file in JSON format. Our silver layer is the first time that we've shredded that and put it into a table, right? That's one way to add value. Another way is to, clean up any nulls, any simple like business rules that happen when there's missing or incomplete or inconsistent data that could happen, between bronze and silver as well. The pattern that I see a lot is to use a lake house for both the bronze and silver layers. But then when data finally lands, fully conformed, fully all the calculations data governed in the warehouse or in the gold layer, that's going to be the warehouse. Because again, that's SQL based. That's where all the data analysts know to use SQL to query. That's, structured in a way that, you can just create a semantic model in Power BI off it instantly. This is a very common pattern. There are people that will put, especially if your data is all tabular to begin with, you're pulling data straight from SQL servers or other database servers. You could have a bronze warehouse, silver warehouse, gold warehouse. But yeah, we are seeing a lot of times people take use Lakehouse for bronze and silver, and they don't use a warehouse until the final landing spot. So one of the other little wrinkles is if we're trying to join data from different data warehouses, we don't, if those data warehouses are in different workspaces, we can't use a four-part naming convention. So we can't say, if you're using a linked server on on premises, you can say linked server dot database name dot schema name dot table name. We can't say workspace dot warehouse name. Warehouse is just another database effectively. Can't say, workspace dot warehouse dot schema table. So if our HR data mart is in an HR workspace and our sales data mart is in a sales workspace, we can't join those together just using SQL in the warehouse. What we can do though is we can create shortcuts to those different warehouses in Fabric and put those shortcuts in the same lakehouse. So then we're really just referring to, within a lakehouse, shortcut name, schema name, table name. And that's only the three-part naming, and then we can join those together just fine. So, little wrinkle there, but just yet the main part of this slide is that when Fabric first came out, and I was no different. I'd have like three slides: Lakehouse versus warehouse. Like, when do you choose one? When do you choose the other? And really, the right answer is choose both. Use them for what they're good at. Use them for their intended who's going to use each one at each layer, and use both. This presentation is up on my GitHub, so you can go, any of the links in it, you can go and just download the slide deck, and you've got access to all the links in here. And I always want to show a little bit for the Fabric Learn, because they've added a ton of really great learning modules to learn over the last 2 years. Like maybe 5 years ago, the tutorials were not best. Now the tutorials they've done for Fabric, they're all really good. They're real world stuff. You can use a 60-day free trial in most cases to work through those. And then this link to the roadmap. Let's just show the roadmap real quick, and it is under my bar, so maybe I can't show it actually. But we could go to the roadmap. Let me, there we go. We go to the roadmap page and we look at which experience we want to choose. So data warehouse. Let's go down. There's our merge Q3. Oh, and I said identity columns was the end of the year. That's identity columns is actually Q3 as well. So by September. So you can look at what's coming. You can look at, okay, what was just recently released. And I can see down here, okay, oh, well, they just put Truncate in the end of last year. This is a really helpful page to go to for all parts of Fabric, not just Data Warehouse, but just Power BI as well. Okay, what's coming in the near future? What's just landed?
All right. I just want to remind everybody about our next meetup, the Power BI Glow Up with Lakshmi. That's going to be on August 21st, 11:30 to 1, virtual again. And so that meeting is actually now live on Meetup if you want to go ahead and sign up for that. We really appreciate everybody coming out. Chris, that was a fantastic presentation on data warehousing. I know that can be a really tough subject, so I'm grateful that you really gave us the beginner intro in data warehousing. So thank you so much for all of your many years of wisdom on that topic. We appreciate everybody being here. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and we will see you guys soon.
Thanks y'all for having me.